Chelek Yud Zayin, Pirkei Avos, Perek Rishon. It's page 347 in the Sefer. This is a Sikha on the first Perek of Pirkei Avos, Mishnah Tezvav. We're going to learn a Mishnah. We're going to ask a series of questions, and then we're going to learn an entirely new understanding in this Mishnah that brings together the entire Mishnah in a whole new way. We are learning the Lenismus of Yosef Binyamin ben Reb Menashe Kaltman. Mishnah Tezvav in Pirkei Avos Perek Aleph says, Shammai Omer, Shammai says, Asei terascha kva. This is translated in the English Siddur as designate times to learning Torah. We'll see in the next paragraph another understanding of these words. But let's say that designate times to learn Torah. Amer ma'at v'asei harbe. Say little and accomplish and do much. And receive each person with a cheerful countenance. So the simple meaning of these three stanzas, these three sections, Fundi Mishnah, is as the Mefarshim explain. And the following Pirush is coming primarily from the Rav, from the Bartanura. Asei terascha kva means that your primary occupation, both during the day and during the night, should be learning Torah. When you get tired from learning, then is when you could work. But not that your primary occupation should be work. As the Chazal have said to us, as osu terasan kva. This is a Gemara in Brachas where it speaks about the Doiros Harishonim, the earlier generations, and it says about them that they would make their Torah primary, the learning Torah primary, and their work secondary. Then the Mishnah continues, Amer ma'at v'asei harbe, zuzogin veinik, to promise little, v'asei harbe, and to deliver a lot, mervi matzu gesagt, to give back, to do more than you promised. And we find this by Avram Avinu. He told the Malachim who came to visit him in the beginning of Parshas Vayera, let me go get some bread. So he promised just bread. And in the end he brought them a calf. He brought them meat. So he promised less and delivered more. And then the Mishnah continues, to receive each person with a smiling countenance. So the Mefarshim explain, when you bring guests into your home, don't give it to them, don't give them what you're offering with your face looking down on the ground, at the ground, which is a euphemism for to give it when you're unhappy about giving it, or giving it with a scowl on your face. So three things. Number one, learning Torah should be your primary occupation. Number two, don't overpromise. As a matter of fact, underpromise, but then do as much as you can. And when you have guests in your home, do it with a smiling face. Lefi says Tamua, if this is the meaning of this Mishnah, this raises a question. The whole idea of Masechta Avos, of Pirkei Avos, is words, is ideas of piety. As Chazal tell us, if someone wants to be pious, he should endeavor to fulfill the teachings of Avos, of this Masechta. Das heißt, meaning to say, we are referring to conduct that is not obligatory upon this person from the perspective of halacha, of the law. He's doing it for the midah of piety, beyond the requirements of the law. So that's the whole idea of Avos. Avos is coming to tell us things that I'm not obligated to do legally, and I'm being told to do so, I'm being advised to do so in order to reach a higher state of Chasidus. So the question is that these three ideas that are spoken about in this Mishnah in the name of Shammai are not really in the category of things that are of piety. Zeir chiyuv is move on for zechalein. The obligation of these three things is self-understood. Or they can be understood and derived from other commandments and obligations in Torah and Halacha, as he's going to explain in a moment. So our question is, these three things are seemingly not mili de chasidusa, they seem to be more basic obligations. And he's going to explain each of the three. Aleph, asay teras chakva. Make that your Torah should be your primary occupation. We find the same expression in things that Chazal tell us as obligations. And this same expression, these same words are actually brought down la halacha. In our attorney refers to the Rambam, to the Tur Shulchan Aruch, to the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. This is the expression that they use. Make that your learning Torah should be your primary occupation, and your work, your job, should be a secondary occupation. So why is it being introduced here as something new and different, that is mili de chasidusa, that is something that is a way to reach a state of piety, if it's a very basic obligation brought in halacha? Additionally, we find many psukim and the Marid Azal, where we are commanded with regard to the constant obligation of learning Torah. So Asay Teras Chakva seems to be the same thing as constantly being engaged in learning Torah. How is there any extra mili de chasidusa in Asay Teras Chakva? Wie se steht in Hanem von dem Perek Gufa, and this idea of constantly learning Torah is understood from the very beginning of this Perek, Pirkei Avos. The world stands on three pillars: Torah, Aveda, and Gemilas Chasadim. Vibal Torah is from the Amudim of Elchas Alzich Terkiyim Ha'elam, and since Torah is one of the pillars upon which the world stands, is the Funech movement as a so it's obvious that the Torah learning has to be permanent, because the world is dependent on it. So this is the first part of the Mishnah, where it says that Torah should be a primary and consistent occupation of a person, is seemingly self-understood and is seemingly more of an obligation than a beyond the letter of the law. Beis, Amar Ma'at. So the way the Mishnah was explained in the previous page, Amar Ma'at means do a promise less and give and deliver more. So the question is, in the area of Nedarim, in the beginning of Parshas Matos, the Torah says, Layachal Dvari, a person should not desecrate his own words. This obligation, this commandment, obligates the person to promise little. To be careful what you promise, be careful what you speak, and never give a promise unless you are 100% certain that you'll be able to deliver. In a mitzvah from the Yachal Dvari, so a person should not fall through in the prohibition of to not desecrate one's word. So Emer Ma'at is obvious. You can't promise something because the Torah says L'yachal Dvari. You shouldn't promise something and then not deliver. So clearly Emer Ma'at is a very, very basic way to make sure not to transgress L'yachal Dvari. Also, when it comes to the conclusion of that section, the person should deliver a lot. Is the here too, there's no major chiddush, no major novel teaching that comes from the perspective of Midas Chassidus. If a yid has the ability to do more mitzvahs, more good deeds, he should do. So a person made a promise to someone that they're going to do something, but they're able to do more than that. Of course, they should do it if it's an area of mitzvahs and ma'asim tevim. So Vasei Harbe is seemingly obvious again. So that's our second part of the Mishnah. Emer Ma'at is understood from L'yachal Dvari, and Asay Harbe is understood from the fact that a person should always do more, as much as they can. Gimel, from the Maimer, so too when it comes to the end of the Mishnah. The Kabbalah is called as a person should receive every other person with a smiling, with a cheerful countenance. This seems to be a conduct that is required because of the Torah tells us to do what is right and what is just. This is basic manners and respect. Additionally, there's also a commandment, love your fellow as yourself. And as the Gemara explains, that this means that do not do to someone else what you do not want to be done to you. So if you want to be received cheerfully, then obviously you should receive the next person cheerfully. This is not something of great piety. This is basic manners. When you meet someone, smile to them, make them feel wanted, like you want to meet with them. And especially, you have a mitzvah to not treat someone the way you would not want to be treated. So we have our general question, and as we explained it in the three details, that each of these three directives of the Mishnah seem to be more basic obligation, understood from other mitzvahs, or understood or self-understood. And what is the mili de chasidusa, and what is the chiddush of the Mishnah? Base. In Sefez, we're going to ask three more questions on specific details in this Mishnah. In the Mishnah, we have to understand specific nuances in the Mishnah. Since all three statements, all three sections are brought together in one mimer, in one statement. Shammai certainly said many more statements with regards to a person's conduct. And specifically these three were brought as one. From this it's understood as that they are connected and intertwined in their message. There's something thematic about these three things, which is why the Shammai says that all three, or the Mishnah brings all three as together in one Mishnah. Base. By Maimer Asete Rosh Chakva, nit Arab gebracht der Oisfir Mulachtige Arai, wie das ist in andere Mamare Resalve demont frier. Earlier we mentioned the Moshe from the Gemara in Brachis, also brought down in Halacha, Asete Rosh Chakva, make your Torah permanent or primary, with Mulachtige Arai, and your work should be secondary. For some, that's the usual phrase. In this Mishnah, he only brings the first half, Asete Rosh Chakva, and doesn't bring the second half, Mulachtige Arai. Why? Gimel, Vigret Meredemol, as it has been spoken many times, the name of the person who said this teaching is connected, and it adds understanding and emphasis to the idea that is being discussed. So the question is, how do these three teachings become better understood because of the fact that Shammai was the one who taught them? So these are our questions. Number one, what is the mili de chasidusa in each of these three statements, based on the way we understood this Mishnah according to the second paragraph in the Sikha in the name of the Bar Tanura? And then why are specifically these three statements brought together? What is the connection between them? Why does the Mishnah not say the words umalachtecha arai? And why does the Mishnah mention that Shammai is the one who said the statement? Before we get to the answer, which is in Sif Dalid, he's going to give a kana mokim lahoyer. Now is the place to comment, which is an introduction to the answer. And what he's going to say in Sif Gimel is that although the source of this pirush is an Avos de Reb Nosson, which is a very early and therefore very powerful source, nevertheless it is totally legitimate to come up with additional explanations of the Mishnah, the additional ways to understand the Mishnah. It is totally acceptable. Kana mokim lahoyer. Chod der mocker from Pirush and Asif Aleph is an Avos de Reb Nosson, although the mocker of this Pirush, which is brought in the Bar Tanura, but the mocker is from Avos de Reb Nosson, which is a very early source. It almost goes back to the times of the Tanoim, and therefore is very, very powerful. From deswegen is dan art eich af zweiten andere shadikin Pirush. It still leaves room for another different explanation. we find in Masechet Avos in various Mishnahs as a sign in the Gourarie Pirush from Gedolei Yisrael that there are many comments, many explanations from Gedolei Yisrael, Rashi, Rambam, Machzir, Vitri, Unoch. Biz achrenim, such as all the way going back from Rashi and Rambam all the way down to more very recent commentators, which explain differently and sometimes even opposite than the Pirushim Avos Rabbi Nosson. And these also, these great Gedolei Yisrael, also encourage their students to delve in deeply and to introduce new explanations. Obviously, with the absolute and important conditions that it should be consistent with the rules of learning Torah, with taking great care to maintain the respect for the Gedolei Torah, and certainly not to scream, or in other words, to impose, accept my opinion, as well as a very important to be careful not to interpret the Torah differently than it is supposed to be, and against what would be the psak din, etc., etc. So there are rules that have to be kept. We have to maintain the kavod of Gedolei Torah. We have to make sure that we interpret it properly. We can't force our opinion onto others. But once we follow those rules, the idea that someone can come and introduce a new pirush is 100% acceptable, as we see that it's been done all along, and we've been encouraged to do so. Therefore, and therefore we understand. This would be similar to the great number of commentaries, including somewhat disagreeing commentaries on Torah Shebiksav, which at least are included in what the Gemara in Yerushalmi uses an expression, chatter of Torah is always good. The Gemara over there, the Talmud Yerushalmi over there says that there is idle chatter, which is bad, and there's Torah chatter, which is good. So even if it may not be considered, an actual legitimate commentary, but still the fact that we're discussing Torah is tovin, it's good. And then on the higher level, if this is being shared by Gedolei Yisrael, by true greats of the Yidden, then this is actually included in the Shifim part of the 70 different ways that you can understand Torah. So there's many commentaries on the Torah. At the least, it's considered positive chatter. At the highest, it's part of Shivim Panim LaTorah. Especially since there is an obligation to add to the Torah. To add, to introduce new things, new explanations in Torah. Especially when if the original explanation creates questions, so we certainly have to put in the effort and the Grechin as far as his mind could reach to explain the Mishnah in a way that the questions get answered. As on them, because without this new explanation, he will lack understanding in this idea. One of the conditions in learning Torah Shebal is understanding. Torah Shebal saying the words is good enough. You can make a birchas HaTorah even if you just say the words. But Torah Shebal it's not enough to say the words. You have to understand. So if a person learns a Mishnah and doesn't understand the Mishnah, then maybe he has to introduce a new understanding, one that will help him understand the Mishnah, so he could fulfill his obligation of learning Torah Shebal. So in Siv Gimel we said that we find great Gedolei Yisrael who argue on the Pirushim of Avos to Rabbi Nosson in how to understand this Mishnah, and they encourage us to bring in new understanding. And just like when it comes to Chumash, when it comes to Torah Shebiksav, there's many, sometimes disagreeing commentaries, and yet they are all part of learning Torah. Certainly, when it comes to Torah Shebal Peh, which has to be understood, and there are questions sometimes on an earlier Pirush, it is certainly acceptable to introduce a new Pirush. It's very interesting how before in Siv Daled, the Rebbe is going to introduce another way of understanding this Mishnah. The Rebbe legitimizes the idea that introducing a new pirush is acceptable as it has been the common practice amongst Gedolei Yisrael all the way back to the Rishonim and all the way down to Acharonim. So let's learn the biur in Siv Daled. And the biur is going to go back to what is Shammai really coming to tell us, and is going to introduce a whole new perspective of this Mishnah, and each of the three parts of the Mishnah are going to flow one into the next, which is going to answer the question, what's the connection between the three of them? The Mishnah Shammai Emer, this Mishnah, the Mishnah in Anei Perek is a follow-up, is a continuation to the first Mishnah in the beginning of this Perek. Al Shleisha Dvarim Elam Emed, the world stands on three pillars: Al HaTeira, V'al Aveda, V'al Gemilas Chasadim, on Teira, on Aveda, which is davening, and on Gemilas Chasadim, acts of kindness. As einen dort drei Sachen, there are three things. Was jeder einer von sie is an Omud. Was halt auf dem Elam, each of them are a pillar which is holding up, which is supporting and sustaining the world. Und der Riber, therefore, wenn ein Mensch kann sich nicht vernehmen b'chol levavoi v'nafsho yom ha'odai midi alle zwei zusammen, if there's a person who cannot engage with all of his heart, with all of his mind, with all of his heart, with all of his soul, with all of his being, with all three pillars at once, darfer sich uiskleib on the chalapachas ein omud kav von die drei, he has to choose at least one pillar, one approach of the three, in welchen reinton seine Kirchayis and his askus, in which he will invest his passion and his involvement. Und die andere zwei kommen danach, and the other two will come secondary. Unless one of the other two is something that the time calls for it for right now. For example, he has to daven now, so then that would take precedence. But other than the fact of the time shazman grama, the person is going to pick one column, one pillar, and invest his time and his energy into that, so that way he could be involved in the sustaining of the world. So the question is going to be, which one should I pick? Should I pick Teira? Should I pick Aveda? Or should I pick Milas Chasadim? And based on this, in continuation to this, says Shammai, following the way of Mili de Chasidusa. If you want to do what's Chasidus, what's pious, I say Tiras Chokva, as for the dry Kavim, Zalera Beiches, and the Anaka for Tiras Chokva. That of the three approaches, he should choose his conduct, that his learning Torah should be his primary occupation. Now, why is it called Milui de Chasidusa? Because he doesn't have to do it that way. He has the permission from a halachic perspective, from a perspective of obligation. He could choose whichever approach he wants. It could be like Zevulun, from the masters of good deeds, meaning someone who's engaged more in good deeds than in learning Torah. Obviously, that his primary occupation is Gemilas Chasadim. So therefore, from halachic perspective, from the obligatory perspective, he could choose to go into business and engage in the kav of Gemilas Chasadim. Shammai is saying that from the perspective of Midas Chasidus, he should choose the kav of Teira. Aziz zayin ba'im der kva und der ikir, that Teira should be the primary and the permanent thing of his life. This answers the question why he doesn't conclude with the words which was one of our questions in Siv Beis. Because here when Shammai says Torah should be your primary occupation, he's not saying Torah in contrast to work. As he's only that work should not be permanent. No, zu mat gesagt, no ist dem Qua von Teire, look at the Kaven von Gabel Gmilas Chasadim. He's saying your Teire should be your primary occupation, in contrast to Aveidik Gmilas Chasadim. So therefore it doesn't say, I say Tirascha Kwa Malachta Cha'arai. We weren't talking about Malacha. This wasn't a debate between Teire and Malacha. It was a debate between Teire, Aveidik Gmilas Chasadim. So therefore he says, I say Tirascha Kwa Teire, and doesn't have to finish Malachta Cha'arai. Teire should be your primary occupation. In that case, why doesn't it say if the discussion here is Torah versus Aveidik Milch Chasadim, so why doesn't he not say that these other two Aveidik Milch Chasadim should be the Arai in contrast to Torah, which is Kva? And he's going to give the answer in two ways. Let me just move on. It also is understood why he doesn't say that the approach of Aveda and the approach of Gemilas Chasadim should be Arai. Varum, the Hera say Teroscha Kva is gesagt geworden next tomorrow Yuvden Tavin. This directive that your Torah learning should be your primary occupation is actually being said also to people engaged in good deeds. Whose time-wise their occupation is mostly not in learning Torah. Sometimes they're fulfilling their obligation by learning one Perek in the morning and one Perek in the evening. Not in Kavim Gmilas Chasadim. So their primary occupation is in the approach of Gmilas Chasadim. Nevertheless, they are also being expected that their Torah learning should be permanent. Their limud Torah in the Mizman Muad Bekamus, the learning Torah in the quantitatively small amount of time, so sein Kavua Be'echos should be permanent qualitatively. Eingekarpt in Nefesh, engraved in his soul. Bisa das Opels and ganzen Tag, to the point that it could impact the rest of the day. So one point he's making over here is, he doesn't want to say that Lamashal Gemilas Chasadim should be Arai, because he's talking to someone who is involved in Gemilas Chasadim. And he's not telling him that he shouldn't do Gemilas Chasadim. He's saying even someone who's doing Gemilas Chasadim, when it comes to learning Torah, even if it's for a few minutes, when he learns Torah, it should be in the manner of Kva. So it's really two instructions. One instruction is that if a person could, they should learn Torah. That should be their primary occupation, as much as possible. But if a person is not learning Torah as much as possible, when you do learn Torah, you should do so in a manner of Kva, in a way that permeates and imbues your entire life, so that it should impact the rest of your day, so that even if you're a person involved in Gemilas Chasadim, you should also be Teroscha Kva. So therefore we don't want to say Gemilas Chasadim Arai, because even the person who's engaging in Gemilas Chasadim all day, we still want the Torah to be Kva. There's another point. The Lashon Arai is nitmasim l'gabe Aveidik Gemilas Chasadim. It's not an appropriate terminology for Aveidik Gemilas Chasadim. Because Aveidah and Gemilas Chasadim, even though Shammai is pushing, is encouraging, I should say, that the Torah should be the choice out of the three, but both Aveidah and Gemilas Chasadim are still fundamental elements of serving Hashem. And they too have to be done. When they're being done, they should be done in a way of permanence, in a way of primary importance. Amongst the three, the main kiva should be in Torah, but it doesn't mean that the other two should not be arai. So there's 2 points over here. Number one, that even someone who's not making Torah kiva in all day, even to him or her, their Torah should be kiva when they're learning. Another point is that we never use the word arai and Aveidik Gemilas Chasadim, because whenever we're doing those, they have to also be in a manner of kava, because they are primary elements of Yiddishkeit. It's just that when one can choose between the three, Shammai is advising to choose Torah. So that is step number one. Shammai is telling us the world is dependent on 3 pillars. If you can't do all 3 at once, choose Torah. Hey, noch Torah, after this directive, as the vision that I kaven is that the primary, most important of the three is Torah. Shami continues to explain in what kind of style should his primary learning be. Since Chazal tell us that learning is great, because learning brings to action. One of the important parts of learning is it teaches us what to do. I might derive from this teaching that a person should engage in learning in a style that he's learning the halachas, he's learning the teachings in order to bring it down to halacha. Das heißt, in Jordan was eine Negea Davke zu pasken in Lacha Lamaisa werden Davka Pesach be Yisrael, that a person should engage in those areas of learning that are relevant to be able to pasken, to rule what is the halacha in practical action, and to utilize this to become a Pesach. Be Yisrael, a person who rules halacha. That's what I would think. Shammai tells me I have to learn Torah. I should learn Torah. That's what's going to hold up the world. Now, what do Chazal tell us? Talmud maybe l'dimaisa. So maybe I should choose the areas in Torah that help me to maisa. The far bavarin ter baldun zogt emoir ma'at. Therefore, it becomes Shammai so different than how he originally understood Emer Ma'at, that it means you should promise little. He says, no, I'm talking about within your learning Torah. Within your learning Torah, it should be speak little. The kind of learning Torah that leads to Emer, that leads to speak out, the psak of halacha, that has to be a minimal amount of learning. The primary and most of his learning has to be learning Torah for the sake of learning. Or either to the point of teach and receive schar for the teaching, or yagdol Torah v'yadir, or to make Torah greater and more beautiful. So Shammai says, "Asay Torah chakva, make Torah your primary occupation." What kind of Torah? And mer ma'at. The part of Torah that's psak halacha should be ma'at. Most of your learning should be lishma, for the sake of learning Torah, for the sake of making the Torah great, etc. So if that's the case, someone can make a mistake. Go to the other extreme. If the emphasis here is not to learn Torah in a way to be able to rule the halacha and to know what to do, is after the von mashma as kiyom mitzvos bechlal ma'ase is a zach was fordert mit chashon king kvius. Then maybe this implies that doing mitzvahs, that ma'ase is not something that demands permanence, that demands a primary occupation in your life. A person should do mitzvahs with dedication and devotion. A person might think so. He said, "Emer ma'at," he said, "Stay away from the halacha." He said, "The river meisiv zogt as zogt on." Therefore, Shammai adds and directs, do a lot. It's true, when it comes to the learning of Torah, the emphasis does not have to be in the area of ruling halacha, but nevertheless, that doesn't change the fact that when it comes to actually doing mitzvahs, it has to be a lot, as the asiyas mitzvahs that the fulfillment of mitzvahs should be in great number. Sayin kamos and sayin echos, both in quantity as well as in quality. Vos mer mitzvahs, to do as many mitzvahs as possible. Umid vos mer chayis nislahavas, and with as much enthusiasm and excitement. So that was Shammai's second statement. I'm telling you to learn Torah, Emer ma'at. Number one, I'm not telling you davka to learn la halacha l'maisa. I'm telling you to learn Torah lishma. But at the same time, don't understand me that mitzvahs are not important. When it comes to the doing of mitzvahs, it has to be in great number, both in kamos and rechos, both in quality and in quantity. So this brings us to the third statement of Shammai. It's going to say, if a person is busy learning Torah, and it's going to explain it very beautifully in Sivav, maybe that means that I don't have time for other people. That's why he ends, that every single person has to be received cheerfully, even though Shammai is encouraging us to delve into Torah. Let's see inside. Since according to Shammai, a Yid has to primarily be involved in learning Torah Lishma, and to a point that you're not so engaged in the halacha l'maisa, and a person could think, we're going to introduce an idea here that might lead a person to think that he should stay away from people. It's known the difference between the attribute of Meichen of the mind and Midas of the emotions. As Meichen is the mind, the intellect of the person is between the person and himself. Midas and its libdim zulus. Midas, emotions or character traits, is something that is expressed to the other person. When you awaken, the impact of a midah can only be felt when there's another person. So, for example, if you have a midah of love, there has to be someone to whom to love. Or if there's a midah of fear, he has to be afraid of someone. So midas there has to be another person involved. But when it comes to intellect, it's the exact opposite. Not only is the mind not there for the other person, the zulus is the other person can actually confuse the process of the intellect. As it is known that if a person wants to reach proper understanding, proper accomplishment on an intellectual level, especially if you're going into the more core areas of the seichel, which is not something that leads to midas and not something higher than piskei halacha. For example, there's certain seichel that causes a person understands that this is a wonderful thing, so he has a desire for it or he has a love towards it. So that's a seichel that creates a midah. But sometimes the person goes into etzem seichel, into the core seichel that is not there to produce midas. So we know that a person to reach and truly comprehend the core of the seichel, person has to contemplate and delve deeply into it. Then it is when he is in isolation. Person isolates himself from other people, delves deeply, thinks about it very strongly, and then he could truly comprehend the seichel. If there's other people around, it could distract him or confuse him. So now a person could reach a mistaken conclusion. That this idea of learning Torah, where the Torah becomes your primary occupation, and in a manner where you're not focused on the halachas, you're focused on learning Torah for Torah itself, which is all about understanding. This requires of him the approach of isolation, to separate himself from another person. And if he will engage with others, he does not with only the type of study partner that will bring him an advantage, a gain in his learning Torah. For example, dibuk chavedim, which is to connect with a study partner that's helping you learn. Pilpul talmidim, the discussion of the talmidim, of the students, von die Sachen was niknis which is mentioned in Perek Vav of Pirkei Avos. These are two of the many different things, ways to acquire Torah. Chazal say, I learned a lot from my teachers. I learned more from my study partners, from my colleagues, and the most I learned was from my own students. So maybe those are the people I can engage with. Either I totally isolate myself, or if I do engage with people, it's people that are either my rebbes, my teachers, or my chavrusas, or my students from whom I'm learning. I already mentioned, but to befriend those types of people that don't help him in his learning Torah in a primary way, in a permanent way. He has to avoid them. To push them away and have nothing to do with them. This is what a person might mistakenly conclude. Since Shammai is encouraging me to learn Torah, and Torah in a way that I'm learning Torah so I understand it well, It's not about the psak halacha, but it's about the understanding Torah well, that I have to stay away from people. I have to stay away from anyone that's going to distract me from learning Torah. And this is what Shammai addresses in the third stanza of his teaching, that they mekabel is kol adam b'seiv upon him yafes mekabel zayin. Sorry, agama zayin ikiris askus isn't living at Torah. Although his primary occupation is learning Torah, from kvar and in a permanent way, which means it takes a lot of his time. And it's actually not focused on halacha. Darfes im nit opalten von aufnehmen jeden einem, it cannot hold him back from receiving every single person on Eisnam without exception. Mit aseve upon him your face with a cheerful countenance. Says Echazadam. Was sein bekennen sich mit ihm, sein Ischabrus mit ihm, wird nicht bringen kann Teyeles in seine Inyanim. Even the type of person that getting to know him and befriending him will not bring him any advantage in his own pursuits. Not only will it not help his learning Torah, it won't help him in the area of Gmilas Chasadim. So there's no gain for this person to engage with this other person. Nevertheless, he should not just plainly receive him, say, okay, I'll be with him. It should be with a cheerful countenance. The other person should see and feel that he's receiving him and he's engaging with him with joy and with devotion, with involvement. So now the Mishnah flows very beautifully. The Pirkei Avos started with Ashles Dvarim Eilameimet, which should be my primary of the three pillars, says Shammai should be Torah. And he says, what kind of Torah? Mirma'at, not so much halacha. By the way, I say harbe, don't misunderstand me, the mitzvahs are not important, mitzvahs are very important. But nevertheless, Torah is also important. Then he says, however, don't allow your engagement in Torah to make you think that you should not be involved with other people. You have to know that whenever you meet another person, even if you have nothing to gain from it, you have an obligation, at least up in Midas Chasidus, to receive this person with a cheerful countenance. The person should know and feel that you're interested in being with him, you're interested in meeting with him, and you're interested in helping him. Now, so the only question that wasn't answered yet is the name Shammai. How does the name Shammai add to the understanding of this Mishnah? And in order to do that, he's going to ask a very basic question. He's going to say that there's a number of contradictions here. On the one hand, you're telling me, Asay Teras Chakvar, Amer Ma'at, then you're telling me Asay Harbe. Then you're telling me I should engage in learning Torah, and at the same time you're telling me I should be friendly to other people that are getting in the way of my learning Torah. How am I expected to engage in so many opposites? And it is Shammai's name that and it is Shammai and his name that are going to help us understand how to do this. So after all this, there's still one question. How can we fulfill all of these directives? Because they, after all, they contradict one another. In other words, and he explains in the parentheses, on the one hand, you're telling me that I should learn Torah, my primary engagement should be in learning Torah, and in a manner where I'm not even involved in Pirkei Halacha. At the same time, you're telling me that I should be engaged in doing mitzvahs, and with a great deal of excitement and enthusiasm. And on top of that, you're expecting of me that I should receive each person with a smiling countenance. It's even more opposite, because the easiest way to be successful in learning Torah is through isolation. Now you're telling me not only should I engage in mitzvahs, but I should also engage with another person. How do I overcome all these contradictions? Therefore, the Mishnah prefaces and lets us know as the the person who taught this teaching is Shammai. And through the message that is alluded to in the name Shammai, that he will be able to fulfill all of the instructions, all of the directives. Look what the Torah back in the name Shammai. Look what the Torah explains with regards to the name Shammai. Therefore, he's called Shammai. Similar to what Chazal tell us, Al Pasik Visham Derech, and the Pasik Visham Derech called Hasham Erchesav, anybody who estimates his ways, he measures the way. What is the best way? How is the best way to do this? That's how a person should live. So the name Sha'az, the name Shammai, versus from Lashon Shomer Chesav, Shammai, which is connected to this idea of, I'm not exactly sure how to translate the word Sham, Shatzen und Wegen, seine Drachim. Shatzen usually means to estimate. Wegen means to weigh his ways, but it means to measure and to figure out what's the best way to go. He's Meramez und so the name Shammai teaches us. Person has to constantly weigh carefully and estimate the path that he's taking. Sein Zman und seine Keiches, his time and his abilities, which were given to him. And when a person weighs out, measures the keiches that he was given, that he will discover. He has the ability and he has the strength to fulfill all of these directives. Especially in the time period which was designated for learning of Pirkei Avos. At that time, special strengths are given. So Family the Chasidus is in Pirkei Avos to fulfill successfully all of the directives that are in Pirkei Avos that are teaching us the various different conducts of piety. When I have good upshots and upmessen them zman v'serhot, and when he will properly weigh out and measure the time that he has, that the zen as the keditzait setelen. You'll see that it is possible to divide his time, to manage his time in such a manner as is maspik zayin satan and yadarin for the dayra. So now that he's able to do in each of these three directives, he could learn Torah, he could do mitzvahs, and he could engage with other individuals. So this has answered all of our questions. We have a brand new understanding of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is telling us the importance of learning Torah, even more important than Avodah Gemil Chassadim. At the same time, what kind of Torah should I learn? The Torah that is Torah Lishma, for the sake of understanding and knowing Torah. Nevertheless, I should not be distracted and think that I shouldn't do mitzvahs, but I have to do mitzvahs harbe, a lot of mitzvahs bekamas ubeechos. I also have to not think that my learning Torah should be a reason that I should avoid other people and isolate myself, but on the contrary, I should receive people with a smiling and cheerful countenance. If you're going to ask how can I do all these things, they seem to be so contradictory. The answer is Shammai. Hashamer Chesav. Measure your time, measure your abilities, recognize what you're able to do, figure it out, and you'll see that you have plenty of time to do everything in the right time and in the right way. In Siv Ches, he is going to teach us a deeper understanding in the name Shammai. And he's going to point out to us that each of these three instructions, directives of Shammai, is actually something that is emphasizing the fact that each thing is there for itself. Torah is there for itself, mitzvahs are there for themselves, and not for any ulterior motives. And the ultimate revelation of that will be when Mashiach comes. And a more deeper and a deeper level, we'll have another explanation of the connection between these three directives of Shammai and the name and the person Shammai. In all three directives, we find that Tzad HaShava a common theme. In Ersten Inyan, as an Iker Kavad of Zayin in Torah, and the first idea that a person that his primary occupation should be learning Torah, and in a manner of a mer ma'at, that says as al limud was lishma, nitzu lipaskin halacha to learn lishma. This expresses the idea that one is learning Torah not for a secondary purpose. I feel in mitzvahs, not even because it will bring you to mitzvahs, nor to live Torah for Torah itself. The idea that I learn Torah for the sake of Torah. I'm not doing one thing. It's not a means to an end. It's an end in and of itself. So too in the second directive, do a lot. Even when he's focusing on his Torah and not in the area of halacha of Torah, therefore mitzvahs. He still has to increase in learning mitzvahs and doing mitzvahs. But it does make that sein kiyum mitzvahs is nitzli batzlacha b'limud Torah. which means that he's doing mitzvahs not for the sake that it should bring him to success in Torah. Because he's addressing that which Chazal tell us, that a person says, I only have Torah, then he doesn't have even Torah. In other words, you need to do Torah and mitzvahs together. As that also a Yeshivel, a Torah learner, has to also have the Aved of Gemilas Chasadim, and also has to have the fulfillment of mitzvahs. But if that's the purpose, if the only reason he's doing mitzvahs is in order for his Torah learning to work, then his doing mitzvahs is considered ma'at. It's a minimal thing. He's doing it because he has no choice. Shazman Grama, for example, the time is demanding it. Because it's Pesach, he has to eat matzah. So he's doing it because he's being told to do it. Not because he sees any advantage in the mitzvah itself. Or else he's doing the mitzvah so that his Torah learning should be better. So that would be considered ma'at. He's doing the mitzvahs only for the sake of something else. But since the Mishnah is telling us do mitzvahs a lot, he's verstandig as ein Maisa mitzvahs is nor mitzad asher kiddushan mitzvahs v'tzivanu, that he's doing the mitzvahs harbe. He's doing a lot of mitzvahs because he's not just doing them the ones that he has to do or the ones that are going to help him. He's doing all of them because the Eibishter sanctified us with his mitzvahs and commanded us, and that's the sole motivation to do the mitzvah. It's not even as a skula, as a way to bring about that the learning of Torah that he does should have a sense of permanence. He's doing the mitzvahs for the sake of mitzvahs because the Eibishter gave us the kedusha through mitzvahs, and that's why he does it. So when it comes to the learning of Torah, he's learning Torah for the sake of Torah, not to bring him to mitzvahs. When he does mitzvahs, he's doing it for the sake of the mitzvahs, because that's what the Eibishter wants, and not for an advantage that he's going to gain from the doing of mitzvahs. And similarly, in the third directive, to receive each person with a cheerful countenance, it's talking about someone from which the person has no gain. There's no personal advantage from engaging with this individual. It's not even the fact that a person could gain that he's doing a mitzvah of Gemilas Chasadim. It's possible that the person doesn't need anything from him. If a person is poor and you give him tzedakah, then you're fulfilling the mitzvah of Gemilas Chasadim. What happens if the person is wealthy? He too has to be received b'sever panim yafis. He's part of kol ha'adam. So he doesn't even get the advantage of doing the mitzvah of tzedakah. But if the other person needs something from the first person, even just the kindness of lifting him up by smiling to him and raising him up from his low spirit, it could be that what's motivating him is the fact that he's doing a mitzvah, and that mitzvah is a benefit for him. The directive of Shammai here is even if there's no gain, there's no benefit for the person who's smiling, who's receiving this other individual with a cheerful countenance, he has to do so solely because it's midas chasidus. Now, so each of these three things you're doing each of them for the thing itself and not for any ulterior motive or for anything that comes from it. And then in this common theme, asai limud ateiru, asai kiyum mitzvos, asai mekabel zayed nidin is jeder von zeh avatar v'tachas v'zich, that learning Torah, doing mitzvahs, and receiving every yidden cheerfully is a goal in and of itself. And not for the purpose of something else, for an ulterior purpose. This expresses the idea that Yidden, Torah, and the Eibishter is one thing. Was the Riber? Geschehen bis ist nicht scheich zu sagen, dass der Eibishter ist Chas Shalom an dem Zoi, it's etwas anders. Just like you cannot Chas Shalom say that the Eibishter is a means, is a conduit to something else. As they is nicht scheich zu sagen, dass Perek Torah say. Similarly, when it comes to the Eibishter's Torah, you can't say that it's a vehicle or a conduit to something else. When it comes to his mitzvahs, and how you treat another Yid, you can't say that it's to lead to something else. So in each of these three things, not only do we see how each of them is important on their own, we see in them the oneness of Hashem. Now, just like Hashem is Hashem for itself, it's not for anything else, so to each of these three things, Torah, mitzvahs, and Yidden, are meant to be done for themselves and not for any ulterior motive. This idea that Torah, mitzvahs, and the Yidden are one with Hashem, and therefore each of them has to be treated as a means of itself, as an end of itself, not a means, as an end of itself. In a revealed way, we will experience this lasted love. Then it's a zayin der gilu from the emes from yeder zach. When Mashiach comes, the revelation of the truth of everything will be revealed. But in the time that we are in now, before a Mashiach comes, it is concealed in each person's Aveda. Was the fire darfen seinen da, when es darfen sein verschiedene Sugim by Yidden. Therefore there are, and there should be, various different categories of Yidden. Those the masters of Torah, which their involvement in mitzvahs and gemilas chasadim is the minority of their days. Or some who do mitzvahs for the sake of Torah. Another category of people are people that are engaged in good deeds. Their primary occupation is to make this world into a dwelling place for Hashem through doing mitzvahs. And the fulfillment of the obligation of learning Torah is less. Or either literally it's done less, or it's being done a lot, but it's for the purpose of that their mitzvahs should be kidduboy. So you have various different categories within each generation. Similarly, we find this difference in the generations themselves. He references Saf Siman Tes of Igeres HaKedesh, where the Alter Rebbe says over there that in earlier days they shined in Limud Torah. Therefore, there were great Tanoim v'Amiroim. In later days, the primary occupation is Tzedakah and Dira B'Tachtenim. So within each generation, you have people that are more involved in Torah, people that are more involved in mitzvahs and Dira B'Tachtenim, like you do over the course of Galus, where certain generations were more focused on Torah, and later generations more focused on Gemilas Chasadim. But either way, where is the ultimate revelation, where you'll see the truth of all of these things, that Torah and mitzvahs and Yidden are all, and the way we treat a Yid is all an end of itself, is all a matar v'tachlis. When does this become revealed? Ultimately, is lost love when Mashiach comes. Und das ist die Sheiches von Baal Amaimer Shammai to the Drei Reis Anal. And this is the connection between Shammai and these three directives. The Rizal says that when Mashiach comes, the halacha is going to be like Bishamai. Das heißt, die Eira von der Gibel an Yonim Anal sind verbunden beikim mit dem Gili von dem Emes von Kol Davar Lasid Lavai. When Mashiach comes, the halacha is going to be like Shammai, which means Shammai Omer. These three things that Shammai is telling us to fulfill, when will we be able to fulfill them properly in a revealed way? When Shammai is halacha kemoisai. When Mashiach comes, and Shammai is the one whose halacha we follow. So that's the connection between the name Shammai and these three directives, because these three directives are teaching us something very, very important. That just like the Eibishter is not the conduit, is not there for something else, so too Torah is there for itself, and mitzvahs are there for themselves, and a Yid is there to be treated for his own proper way, not for any benefit that we receive from it. And Shammai teaches this because ultimately this will be realized when Mashiach comes. Since, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, all the revelations of the Asid are dependent on our deeds during Galos, and in our deeds of now, there is a miniature revelation of the Asid. Is move on to my sepel kapan and the kiyum from the other Drei Reis. We're not expected to wait until Mashiach comes, but in actuality, we should begin fulfilling these directives already now. And that's how he'll be able to reach the level of Shammai from the first explanation. And read, oh, Pshatz and Abeg and Tanekeches, he could measure and weigh his strengths. Wissen die Kazarat and Sinas Keach Meyuchid, of Kenes Elder and to discover that he has the special strength needed to be able to fulfill them all. And a way a person conducts himself, that is what he's given in return. When a Yid fulfills the entire commandment, till the end, that he receives every Yid with a smiling countenance, he merits that he should receive from above also a shining countenance, the face, the countenance of the live king is shining, to the point of eternal life, which will be lost in love in the Zman of Tchias HaMesim. Let's call Yisrael Yisrael Chelek Leilam Haba, in the time of Tchias HaMesim, which every year does a Chelek Leilam Haba, which call Yisrael is also part of the beginning of Pirkei Avos.